Welcome back to Basic Business Training 1, and we are so happy that you can join us again for this session. In our last session, we talked about ethics and how ethics need to come out of our biblical worldview. And now we are finally finished with the foundation of our business, and if you see in your workbook a structure of the business, you will see that we are moving from the foundation now to the walls of our business. And the walls of our business are a very important part. We call that our boundaries. And so our session today is boundaries, how to manage our relationships and our businesses with love. And so we will be getting into that. And I want to start this session by having you again look at a figure in your workbook. And there's a diagram that has several squares and a circle. And the diagram on the side that has the circle in the middle, that's your business. And there are arrows that are extending to 4 other boxes that include, that say me, for myself as the owner, my friends, my relatives, and my family. And the question that is being asked of that diagram is, does that represent healthy boundaries in relationships or in business? And so in that diagram, you can see that I have access to the business, that my family, my friends, and my relatives also have access to the business directly. Beside that, you see a different diagram. And this time, again, business is in the center, but this time there's only one connection, and that connection is only going to me as the owner of that business. And this time, the relatives and the families and the friends, they are all being directed to me rather than to the business itself. And again, we want to ask the question, which of these represents a healthy relationships, healthy boundaries in business? And I hope you see that it's the second one, that it's the one where not everybody has access to the business. It's true that friends and family, relatives, they can be customers to the business. They can shop at the business, but they should not be seeking the business for their own personal gain. That is to be controlled and managed and directed by you, the owner of the business. And that is what we want to be talking about in this particular session. And typically when we do this session, there's a lot of great dialogue and discussion about what it means to have healthy boundaries and how do we have healthy boundaries in our relationships. In our businesses, especially as it relates to our relationships. One of the things that I have seen in teaching in the majority world is that most of the majority world is what we would describe as a warm culture. And a warm culture has nothing to do with the temperature that is in the area. It has to do with how warm we are towards each other. In a warm culture, we tend to see the community as more important than the individual. In North America, where I have been born and raised, we are not a warm culture. We are a cold culture. And in a cold culture, the individual is more important than the community. And so the individual comes first. In a warm culture, you have a better sense of loving your neighbor. And that's a very good thing, and it's a very godly thing. But it's very difficult to run a business in a warm culture because of that challenge. In a cold culture, we might not be as good at loving our neighbor, but on the other hand, it's easier for us to protect our businesses and to help it to grow. Let me give you an example of what I mean by a warm culture and a cold culture. I'm the youngest of 5 children. My oldest sister, Elizabeth, has 12 biological children. Now, that's very unusual in Canada for somebody to have 12 children, but Elizabeth has 12 children. And if we lived in a warm culture, let's say that we lived in Kenya, Elizabeth was having a difficult time with her son Nathan, who's I think the 6th or the 7th child. She would not just even call me to say, Renita, would you help me? She would send Nathan to me, and in a warm culture, the expectation would be that Elizabeth is part of my family, part of my community. I would take Nathan, and I would help Elizabeth out by taking Nathan in as one of my own and helping to raise Nathan. Now, in a cold culture, things would happen a little bit differently. Elizabeth certainly would not send Nathan to me without checking with me. She might call me and say, Renita, I'm having some challenges with Nathan, and I'm wondering if you would help me. Now, in a cold culture, my response would be, Well, Elizabeth, I love you, and I love you as my sister, but you did not consult me when you decided to have 12 children. That was your decision, and therefore your children are your responsibility. Now, I can help talk to you about ways that you can problem solve and to think through ideas, but in a cold culture, people are responsible for their individual and personal decisions. That is the priority, is that we are to bear with the consequences of what we do on our own. In a warm culture, it's more of the community that is going to work together and circle together. How does this then relate to a business? Well, in a warm culture, if people need assistance and help from you, and all of your business money is going into one pocket, the inclination is going to be to give that assistance out, and the difficulty will be to say, no, I'm sorry, I cannot help you, because that is the business's money. It is not my own money. And so that is one of the things that we are talking about and looking at about boundaries. And so we want to say that if you are in a warm culture, we want to help establish healthy boundaries while still knowing how to love our neighbor. In a cold culture, we may need to learn better how to love our neighbor while keeping good boundaries. And so there are challenges and opportunities wherever you are listening to this message from. I kind of like to think about a bucket of crabs. And I don't know if you have crabs in your areas, but crabs are little critters that come from the sea, and they have very sharp pincers. And if you think about a bucket of crabs that's about half full of crabs, the crabs are alive. They're not happy to be in that bucket. They want to get out. How will that crab get out of the bucket? Well, the first one tries, and in order to get out of the bucket, he's got to step on the other crabs to be able to reach up. And finally, after some point, he may get one of his little pinchers up to the top, and he gets the other one up. And the family members down below are going, yay, hooray, and they all grab onto that crab and oops. Excuse me, they pull it down. They pull down that crab, and now he's stuck at the bottom of the bucket again. And so he tries again to get himself up and get to the top of that bucket, and a similar thing happens. How is that crab going to get out of the bucket? One of the things that we have seen that needs to happen, and this is a little painful even to say, is that to get out of that bucket, that crab is going to have to kick off those people who are grabbing onto him so that he can get out. Now, that's a hard decision to make, but sometimes if you are able to kick off the other crabs, you are able to pull yourself out of the bucket, and now you don't leave and forget about the rest of the family in the bucket. Now, from a position of strength, you are able to reach down and help others get out. And so that's what we want to talk about. There, in establishing boundaries and establishing walls in your business, there might be some painful decisions that have to be made. But at our hearts, at the core of what we want to do is to remember that we are also to do this with love, and love includes our limits, our obligations, what we do with values, and what we do with excellence. And so let's look at that a little bit closer. In our limits, we want to look at the boundaries of our capacity. What are the boundaries that we have? Because we are not God. We do have limits. What are our physical boundaries? What are our financial boundaries? Our emotional boundaries or limits, our relational limits, and our functional limits. For our O, the O in love, we look at our obligations. We have obligations, and who are those commitments to, and what are the expectations? The V is values, where we want to look at what is important to us and what are our priorities. And the E is excellence. What do we do best? Another way to look at this is in our relationships, whether it's family, business, friends, or in church, what can we do? Those are our limits. What do we think we should do? Those are our obligations. What is the most important to do? Those are our values. And what is the best thing to do? And that is excellence. If there's anything that I have seen over the years of working in West and East Africa primarily, it is that a lack of boundaries, a lack of walls in a business is the most common thing for what breaks down a business. A lack of separating the business from yourself, protecting it as something that God is the owner of and you are the manager of. So I hope that you hear this as clearly as you can and see how it can apply to your life and to your business. So let's start with limits. What are boundaries? What are the purpose of having boundaries and of having walls? And one of the things that we like to ask is, every country has borders. Every country has boundaries. What is the purpose of the borders in our countries? Well, the purpose of our borders is to protect the citizens from within, not only the citizens, but the resources that are found in that country, so that those citizens who live there can flourish by being able to use those resources that are found there. Another thing that we know that boundaries and borders give us is the ability for us to identify ourselves and to distinguish ourselves from others. We know that sometimes these boundaries, these borders were formed not necessarily pertaining to people groups, but after some time we begin to identify ourselves by the country that we are from. Boundaries also then show division. They say this is who we are, but it also says this is who we are not. Now, the question is a country ever considered to be selfish for having borders? And I hope that we would say no. In fact, often when I ask this question, we say no. In fact, somebody tries to invade your borders and the army is sent in, and it's expected that you will be able to protect your borders for the sake of the citizens and the resources within the country. So, if it is not selfish for a country to have borders, we have to ask for ourselves and our business, is it selfish, is it wrong for us to have boundaries in our business and have a way in which to say no to people, to say no to demands that are outside of our business in order to protect the business itself? Your business is not able to do everything that you want it to do. You have to ask yourself, what are the limits that are involved in my business? Limits are therefore not selfish. They are not disobedient. They are not a sign of rebellion. And I know that in some of the places where you are listening to this, if you start to say no, you may be called selfish. You may be called wicked. You may be called these other things because the expectation, the cultural expectation, is that if you have a need and I have a resource, I am expected to give that to you. The difference here is that the business is not your own. The business is God's business, and you have a responsibility for your customer and for your employees to help that business continue to exist. And so you have to define those limits for yourself and for the sake of the business so that that business can continue to survive and do what it needs to do for your customers and for your employees and for your own family and for the community. We do not set limits as a sign of anger. We are not setting limits to cut off or to isolate people. We are not setting limits to try to produce guilt or fear or resentment. That is not the purpose of limits. And I know from having taught this course for many years that's going to be the fear from some of you. The idea of kicking these crabs off is it's going to present some challenges and some difficulties in relationships. And to be very honest with you, there are a number of people who decide they can't do it. And so they make a decision that they would rather have peace. They would rather be in the bucket together so that even if my business closes, at least if I need help in the future, I can ask for help. And that's your decision that you have to make. But if you believe that God owns your business, and if you believe that your business is meeting a need and has the capacity to help more people flourish, you may have to make some of those painful decisions to say no to people who do not and should not have access to the business assets. So instead, limits should be seen as positive. Limits are a way to provide discipline and structure. Limits are best set when they are set before you even are tested. You have to know what you will do when those limits are tested. Just like with children, we set limits with children, and I remember my daughter saying to her, "Don't touch the stove." And the first thing that she wants to do is to see how close she can get to that stove to touch it. And when we set limits with family or with church members, those who want our business to do something for free to them, there will be some testing of that, and we need to know what our response will be to that. And actually, we have found some very creative things that people have done in order to set those limits. One woman who went through this course, and she was learning about the importance of setting limits in her business. She thought, I can't bring myself to say no to people myself. And so she prayed about it, and she considered what she was going to do, and she ended up hanging a sign in her business, and the sign said, "Under new management," because she now realized that God was the owner of her business and she was the manager. And when somebody came and they asked to take their goods on credit, she didn't know the person. In the past, she would have had a hard time saying no. She would point to the sign and say, "I'm sorry, but under the new management, I'm not allowed to do that." And so we find ways to be able to say no, to be able to set limits in a culture where it might be very difficult to do that. Limits also have to be able to change. We have to be able to be flexible and to be able to roll with things as we are doing them. We don't set them in stone, but we have to be honest first and foremost to what is the capacity, the financial capacity, the physical capacity of this business to be able to extend help to other people. Ultimately, limits are meant to give freedom. The 10 Commandments that God has given us, they are not meant to restrict us and to keep us down, but rather when we live out the 10 Commandments, we find that there is freedom and that there is joy and that there is contentment. To be told not to covet is not something that's just telling us you should not, but rather it's saying be content with what you have. Keep your eyes focused on what God is doing in and through you. Don't be envious of others and look to others and compare. The limits that you set in your business are also to help you define and to flourish in the business that God has given you. Galatians 6:7-10 says, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." And what I have seen often in business is people will say, "I didn't have a choice. I didn't have an option. I had to help. I had this, I had that. I had a funeral. I had a wedding. I had all these different things, and I had to take from the business, and now I have no inventory. I have no stock." But God cannot be mocked. You reap what you sow, and if you have not established limits in your business, then you can't be very surprised when all of a sudden your business goes down because you have not established walls, you have not protected what God has given you to help you feed your family, to provide work and jobs for others, and to provide a resource for the community which it needs. Galatians 6 goes on to say, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers." Now, I've had people sometimes say, well, that seems like a contradictory verse to be talking about limits because it's saying we need to help everybody. But actually, it's not saying that we need to help everybody. It says, therefore, it says, let us not become weary in doing good. We have limits. We are not God. God is able to do good to all things, to all people at all time. We are not. We have limits to what we can do. And so often I hear of people exhausted and worn out and burned out because they believe as Christians they must say yes to everything and everybody, but that is not what we are being told to do. We are being told here by Paul to make sure that we don't become weary in it. We have to protect ourselves so that we can continue to do what God is doing. Then it says, therefore, as we have opportunity. Not every need that comes your way is an opportunity that you must meet. Other people have opportunities as well. Other people can speak into that. You have to weigh what God is asking you to do through prayerful consideration, talking to other wise people around you for what you say yes to and what you say no to. There's often an urgency in people that when they are looking for help, and it's difficult to say, thank you for your request. I need to take some time. I need to pray about it. Our heart wants to immediately help, and sometimes we are not doing that because we actually are full of loving kindness, but actually we are fearing the results of saying no, and so we have to consider that. And so we want to do good, but there are limits to our ability to do good. Next, we want to look at our obligations. So L for in love is our limits. O has to do with the obligations, because the reality is we cannot love everybody. We cannot give to everybody, but there are obligations that we do need to consider. What are the commitments that you have? What are your obligations? One important distinction that I like to use to help us consider who are our obligations is the difference of the word for and the word to. I am responsible for some people, and other people I am responsible to. The ones that I am responsible for, those are my obligations. The ones that I'm responsible to, I may be accountable and I may be in good relationship with them, but it is not my responsibility for taking care of them. Unlike limits, obligations might not be chosen. They might be determined by birth. Who are the ones that you are responsible for? Well, we get lots of answers when we consider this, and actually, the challenge that I would give you is I really think it's your children that you are responsible for. But even that, there are limits for our children, for when we are responsible for them. When they become an adult, they need to be operating on their own. You no longer are responsible for them, you are responsible to them as a parent, as a family member, as somebody who dearly loves each other. But there's a problem when we have an older adult child who is living with us, depending on us as a child, rather than the independent adult that God has created them to be, with capacity and ability to contribute and to flourish. And so sometimes we say we are responsible for our parents. Well, we are responsible to our parents until they cannot take care of themselves. And when they get to an age where they are elderly and they are incapacitated, we become responsible for them again. And I know in your cultural setting that may be very different than what you're living out. I'm just asking you to think about, who are we responsible for and who are we responsible to? Are we responsible for our pastor? I would say we're responsible to our pastor. Our pastor, as an adult, is responsible for him or herself, and we are responsible to them, but we are not responsible for them. What about a spouse? This one often gets a little bit of controversy when we have discussions about it, and my argument would be is that it's both. I'm responsible for my husband only when he's sick and when he's incapacitated, but we are responsible to each other in a mutually submissive relationship where we are able to encourage each other and help each other to be fully who God has created us to be. So it's a for and a to. If I was fully responsible for my husband, he really wouldn't need to do anything because I would be responsible to take care of him. And I don't think that that's a healthy approach in marriage. And so you have to weigh for yourself. Who is God telling you that you are responsible for, and who are you responsible to? If you have dependent or physically disabled or sick children or adult children or siblings that you need to care for because of disability, that's an obligation that you need to fulfill. But there are a lot of people who want you to believe that you are responsible for them, when in reality you are responsible to them. For this, again, I like to go back to Galatians 6, verses 2 through 5. And in this particular situation, we hear that Paul is saying in verse 2, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Then in verse 5, Paul continues and says, for each one should bear his own load. And it always makes me smile because I think, Paul, are you confused? I mean, in verse 2, you said bear one another's burdens. And in verse 5, you said bear your own load. Which one is it? Well, when we dig a little deeper into some of the language that was used at this time, we see that a burden is something that is extra heavy. It's something that's in addition. Whereas the load is what each one of us has been given to carry and we are responsible for. Let me illustrate this with a little story. I want you to imagine that I'm 9 months pregnant. All right, I'm very pregnant, and I can't even see my feet, and I'm swollen, and I'm uncomfortable, and I'm carrying this pen, and all of a sudden, I drop my pen. And you're standing next to me or around me, and you see my condition, and my eye meets your eye, and with a smile, you bend down, and you get the pen for me, and you hand it to me, and I'm very appreciative. Because right now, I'm carrying an extra burden that makes it very difficult for me just to get down and to get back up. Now it's 6 months later, and I've had the baby, and the baby is healthy, and I am healthy, and everything is good, and I'm by you again, and I drop my pen again. This time I look at you, I kind of liked it when you helped me the last time. And this time you look back at me and you don't do anything. And I need to bend down and I need to get the pen myself because that is my load. That is the expectation that I have. I am able to pick up my own pen, and I should pick up my own pen. If you pick up my pen for me when I'm able to pick it up, eventually I will start looking at you to do more things to me, and I will start believing that I don't have the capacity to do it for myself. And so what Paul is, I think, encouraging us to remember is that, yes, we have obligations, but we need to be careful that each person can flourish to be the person God has given them to be and does not become dependent. So we are responsible for very few people because God has created us as image bearers to be able to carry our own load. We want to then move on to values. When we come to the word love again, we are looking at limits, at obligations, and at values. Values is where we consider what is important to us. What are the priorities that align with our values? And we have to make decisions based on how we manage our business of the values that we believe God is calling for us to have in this business. There are many values that we might want to choose to say that we have. If we say that we believe God is the owner and we are the managers, that means that we are doing our work as an act of worship. In that is implied that we will do the work with ethical, biblical worldview. We will do our work with integrity. And there are things that then when we make those decisions, when we say that this is a value, we need to be able to live that out and carry that out. And we need to make those decisions because the world will cause us to enter into difficult dilemmas that if we have not made it clear that this is who we are, we will begin to do things that do not align with those beliefs. Matthew 6, verse 33 says, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." And so we are being encouraged here to seek the Lord, to seek his kingdom and his kingdom to come on earth in and through our business. What are the values that come out of that type of a prayer? Luke 14, verse 25 to 33 says, "Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build and wasn't able to finish.'" And so we have to look at the values and be able to consider the values that God is asking us to have as it relates to protecting our business so that the owner of the business can have his purpose, his perspective, and his impact in the world through what you are doing in your business. You are the manager of the business. Lastly, we want to look at excellence. We have L is love. Is limits. O is obligations. V is values. And then E is excellence. I love the statement that says, "Good is the enemy of best." Good is the enemy of best. We need to learn the art of saying no and figure out what we do best and then do it. Too often, a lot of us end up doing a lot of good things, but we never get around to doing what is best. What has God given you a special, unique talent for that you aren't able to develop because you feel so obligated to say yes, yes, yes to different things, and you're not able to develop that one good thing that God is hoping that you will fulfill during your time on this earth? And so what is it? What is the things that you are doing that are good, but that are not mandatory that you do, that are a distraction rather? And how can you, in developing your business and in understanding your gifts and your time and your talent that you have and the limited resources that you may have, what is it that you can be developing that can be an answer to somebody else's prayer that they are looking for in this world? What is the best thing that you can do? You have to do that, you have to understand your strengths. You have to understand your weaknesses. You need to make an honest assessment of those, and you may need impact from other people. You need to let your yes be yes and your no be no. Sometimes we say yes to things and we do it with half a heart because we didn't really want to say yes, but we were afraid to say no. Sometimes we say no to things that we really should have said yes to because we aren't considering putting it before God in prayer. And so we really need to understand ourselves and to know who we are and get that input from others so that we can base everything we do on the biblical truth that is from God. Ephesians 4:15 and 25 says this, to discover what is excellent. It says, instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. Proverbs 9 verse 8 says, do not rebuke mockers or they will hate you. Rebuke the wise and they will love you. We don't like rebuke, at least I don't like rebuke. Many of us don't like it. But there is truth that can be heard in that, and we need to be able to take and receive that so that we can do our work with excellence and to know what we say yes to and what God is calling us to say no to. As we come to the end of the session, I want you to think about the boundaries that you have. Do you have good solid walls in your business? Are you protecting your business? Do you understand what your limits are? Do you understand your obligations? Have you come to agreement on your values, and are you working towards what is excellent that God is calling you to do? This is a challenge, and it's a challenge for us to consider how to begin living this out. And I hope and encourage you to have these conversations with each other because there are many, many great things that can come out of this. There are so many people that I have heard that have established boundaries and their business begins to flourish and they actually can hire more people and create more jobs and there's more profit for them as a family. They can give more to the church and so on. When those limits are established, there are good things that can come out of that. So my prayer for you is that God will give you the courage and the capacity and the compassion and the competence to look at your business with honest and realistic eyes to see whether you have good and solid walls, that you are protecting God's business for the flourishing of the customer, the flourishing of your employees, and the flourishing of yourself as well. Thank you so much for being with us in this session, and we look forward to seeing you next time. God bless.